In the silence between stars, there is a kind of peace that most species never learn to feel. It takes millennia. It takes the rise and fall of empires, the cooling of suns, the slow drift of worlds through the endless dark. It takes watching your own history become myth, and myth becomes something older still, something carved into the bones of the universe itself. The Valeth hierarchy had learned that peace. For 11,000 years we had sailed the cosmic winds, building wonders that younger species could not even comprehend. We had mapped the spiral arms, we had seeded dead worlds with life. We had touched the event horizons of black holes and returned with mathematics that bent reality to our will. We had looked upon the galaxy and seen our own reflection. And in our arrogance, we had believed that reflection would last forever. My name is Veris Thol. I was, the High Coordinator of the 17th Fleet, keeper of 42,000 ships and the souls aboard them. I was born in the crystalline spires of Kethros Prime, raised in the traditions of my ancestors, taught that the universe was a garden and the Valeth its eternal gardeners. I believed that with every fiber of my being. I believed it until the Harrow came. The first reports arrived like whispers in the night. A colony world gone silent, then another, then a dozen. The monitoring cast dismissed them as communication failures, solar interference, the usual bureaucratic explanations that ancient civilizations use to avoid confronting the unthinkable. We had grown so accustomed to our own permanence that the concept of existential threat had become almost theoretical. You speak as if you understand. I don't pretend to understand the specifics of what you're facing, he said, but I understand what it means to watch everything you've built crumble around you. I understand what it means to realize that all your preparation, all your planning, all your strength, none of it was enough. His voice remained calm, steady, but there was something beneath it that I could not quite identify. Something old. Humans have a saying, he continued. We say that experience is what you get right after you needed it. Your people have 11,000 years of experience in building, in ruling, in guiding the galaxy. But experience fighting something that genuinely threatens your existence. He shook his head. That's a different kind of experience. And you have this experience? I could not keep the skepticism from my voice. Webb exchanged a glance with Commander Chen. High Coordinator, he said quietly. Humanity has been fighting for our survival since before we learned to make fire. We've faced extinction events on our homeworld, ice ages, plagues, wars, asteroids, climate collapse. We've nearly wiped ourselves out more times than we care to count, and every single time we've clawed our way back. He paused. Not because we're stronger, not because we're smarter, but because we refuse to stop trying. That is admirable, I said carefully. But the Harrow are not a natural disaster. They are not a disease or a war between nations. They are something else entirely, something that defies. I remember the exact moment I understood. I was standing in the observation chamber of my command vessel, the Eternal Vigil, watching the stars drift past in their familiar patterns. A junior officer approached me with a data tablet, her crest feathers trembling in a way that I had never seen before. High Coordinator, she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. The Outer Rim Collective. They're gone. Gone? I repeated the word as if it were foreign. What do you mean, gone?
The entire sector, 40 billion souls, 700 worlds. She held up the tablet with shaking hands. There is nothing left but debris clouds and silence.
That was the moment the peace ended. That was the moment I learned that 11,000 years meant nothing to the void. The Harrow did not negotiate. They did not demand. They did not even communicate in any way we could understand. They simply consumed. We called them the Harrow because that was what they did to everything they touched. They carved furrows of emptiness through the fabric of civilization. Their ships, if they could be called ships, were vast geometries of dark metal and pulsing energy, moving through space with a terrible purpose that defied our every attempt at analysis. They did not conquer. Conquerors want something: territory, resources, submission. The Harrow wanted only an ending. Within 2 cycles, they had obliterated 17% of our territory. Within 5, they had pushed us back to the core worlds. Our fleets, the pride of 11 millennia, burned in the darkness by the tens of thousands. Our defensive stations, each one a marvel of engineering that had taken centuries to perfect, were torn apart in hours. I watched worlds I had known my entire life vanish from the star maps. Kethros Prime, the archives of Seleth, the garden worlds of the Eastern Arm. Gone. All of them gone. And still the Harrow came, relentless, patient, inevitable. The Council of Hierarchs convened in emergency session for the first time in 3,000 years. I was there, standing among the greatest minds and leaders of our civilization, watching as beings who had guided the fate of trillions struggled to comprehend what was happening. The chamber, carved from a single piece of crystalline stone harvested from the heart of a dying star, had always felt like the center of the universe. Now it felt like a tomb. "We cannot fight them," High Matriarch Selethvar said, her ancient voice trembling with exhaustion and grief. "Our weapons, our tactics, our strategies, they adapt to everything. They learn faster than we can innovate."
"Then we evacuate," another counselor argued. "We take what we can save and flee to the outer territories."
"There are no outer territories anymore," someone shouted. "They're everywhere. They're in every direction. We are surrounded by an enemy we cannot understand, cannot reason with, cannot—" "Enough!" The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Hierarch Vanthos, the eldest among us. He was over 600 years old, his scales faded to a pale silver, his eyes still sharp with the weight of ages. "There is one option we have not yet discussed."
The chamber fell silent.
"The Galactic Coalition," he said quietly.
"We must ask for help."
The words hung in the air like a curse. The Valith hierarchy had never asked for help. We had offered it, certainly, guiding younger species, sharing our wisdom, benevolently overseeing the development of lesser civilizations. But to ask? To admit that we could not solve a problem ourselves? It was unthinkable. And yet, the coalition contains dozens of species, Vanthos continued. Some of them have capabilities we do not fully understand. Some of them may have encountered threats we have not. At the very least, they may provide additional forces, additional time. Additional corpses, Selethvar muttered. Perhaps, Vanthos's voice did not waver, but we are running out of our own. I spoke then, surprising even myself. There is one species in particular that we should consider, one that we have overlooked.
Every eye in the chamber turned to me.
The humans, I said.
The silence that followed was heavier than any I had experienced before.
I must explain something about humanity as we understood them then. They were young. Impossibly, almost offensively young. Their recorded history stretched back perhaps 10,000 years, and their spacefaring period was measured in mere centuries. By the standards of galactic civilization, they were infants, barely out of the cradle, still learning to walk among the stars. And yet there was something about them that had always unsettled the elder races. They adapted too quickly. They learned too fast. They had a way of looking at ancient problems and seeing solutions that no one had considered, not because they were wiser, but because they simply did not know that those solutions were supposed to be impossible. We had studied them, of course. All the elder races had. We had watched them climb out of their gravity well on pillars of fire and crude chemical propulsion. We had observed their chaotic political systems, their endless internal conflicts, their bizarre tendency toward both extreme cruelty and inexplicable compassion. Our official assessment had been dismissive. Promising but unstable, the cultural analysis had concluded. Unlikely to survive their own development without significant guidance. Recommend observation only with limited contact to prevent cultural contamination. We had never offered that guidance. We had simply watched them from afar, waiting for them to fail. They had not failed. Instead, they had built a civilization that sprawled across 300 worlds, established themselves as respected members of the Galactic Coalition, and developed technologies that, while crude by our standards, demonstrated an unsettling ingenuity. And now, as the harrow consumed everything we had built, I found myself wondering if our assessment had been wrong. The journey to human space took 17 days. I traveled on a light diplomatic vessel, stripped of weapons and emblems, carrying nothing but myself and a handful of aides. The eternal vigil and what remained of my fleet stayed behind, holding the line against an enemy that could not be held. I spent most of those 17 days standing at the observation windows, watching the stars slide past, wondering how many of them would still be there when this was over. The harrow had taken everything from me except the capacity for hope, and even that was fading. When we finally crossed into human-controlled space, I am not sure what I expected. Grand stations, perhaps? Aggressive patrol vessels? Some display of power that would reassure me that we had made the right choice. What I found instead was a small, functional outpost at the edge of their territory. Its design was utilitarian. No crystalline spires, no aesthetic flourishes, just grey metal and efficient angles. A single human vessel approached us, running standard identification protocols. "Valith diplomatic craft," a calm voice said over the communication channel. "This is Border Station Sierra 7. We've received your approach notification. Please hold position while we confirm your credentials." I waited. The voice returned after a few minutes. "Credentials confirmed. High Coordinator Varys Thal. You're cleared for approach. Docking Bay 4. Someone will meet you." That was all. No ceremony. No acknowledgement of my rank or the significance of my visit. Just directions. I found it oddly refreshing. The woman who met me at the docking bay was perhaps 40 years old by their standards, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything. "High Coordinator," she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "I'm Commander Sarah Chen. Welcome to Sierra 7. I returned the gesture, noting the calluses on her palm, the slight tension in her shoulders. She was not relaxed, but she was contained, controlled.
"Thank you for receiving me, Commander," I said. "I understand that my arrival was unexpected."
We had some notice. She turned and began walking down the corridor, expecting me to follow. The Coalition network isn't as slow as some people think. When a Valeth High Coordinator requests emergency transit through our space, we pay attention. And yet you did not ask why. She glanced back at me, something flickering in her eyes that I could not quite identify. "We figured you'd tell us when you were ready." We walked in silence for a moment. The station around us hummed with quiet activity. Personnel moving through corridors, the distant sounds of machinery, the subtle vibration of life support systems. It was so modest compared to our own stations that I almost felt embarrassed for them. And yet there was an efficiency to it, a sense of purpose that I found myself respecting despite my prejudices. "High Coordinator," Commander Chen said eventually, "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. You don't have to give one, but it would help." "Ask." "Are you running?" The question struck me like a physical blow. Not because it was offensive. I had expected some form of challenge, some attempt to establish dominance. What struck me was the way she asked it. There was no accusation in her voice, no judgment. Just curiosity. And something else. Concern. "Yes," I said quietly. "We are running." She nodded slowly. "I thought so. The reports we've been getting from the outer sectors have been fragmentary, but the pattern is clear." She stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "How bad is it?" I met her eyes. In 11,000 years, the Valeth had rarely shared weakness with outsiders, but something about this human's quiet directness made honesty feel like the only possible response. "We have lost 63% of our territory," I said. 412 billion of our people are dead. The Harrow cannot be stopped, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be understood. They simply destroy, and they never stop. And we are running, because if we do not run, we will cease to exist. Commander Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Come with me. There's someone you need to talk to." The room she led me to was small and plain, a conference chamber with a single table, a few chairs, and a screen on one wall. A man was already waiting there, younger than Commander Chen, with brown skin and patient eyes. "High Coordinator Varys Thal," Chen said. "This is Dr. Marcus Webb. He's our Xeno-Relations Specialist." "Doctor." I inclined my head slightly. "High Coordinator." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss." I sat, feeling the weight of 17 days of travel and centuries of pride pressing down on my shoulders. Webb took a seat across from me, while Chen remained standing, watching. "Before we begin," Webb said, "I want you to understand something. We're not going to judge you for coming here. Whatever you need to tell us, whatever you need to ask, this is a safe space for that." I stared at him. "A safe space?" "Mm-hmm." He folded his hands on the table. "You've been fighting something alone for how long now?" 8 cycles. Roughly 32 of your months. 32 months of constant warfare against an enemy you can't beat. He nodded slowly. "That's a long time to carry something like that. A long time to watch your people die without being able to stop it.
Tell me about them. I blinked. I'm sorry?
Tell me about the Harrow. Webb leaned forward slightly. Not the official reports, not the tactical analyses. Tell me what you've seen, what you've felt. And despite every instinct telling me to maintain composure, to project strength, I found the words spilling out of me. I told him about the 17th Fleet's last stand at Kelos Minor, how we had positioned ourselves perfectly, how our weapons had struck true, and how the Harrow had simply absorbed everything we threw at them and continued forward without slowing. I told him about the civilians we had tried to evacuate from the Garden Worlds, the ships we had lost protecting them, the moment when I realized that we were not saving them, but merely choosing which millions would die first.
The battle began at a place the humans called Threshold Point, an arbitrary designation for a region of space where our projections suggested the Harrow would be most concentrated.
I stood on the bridge of the Unconquered, surrounded by human officers, watching the tactical displays as the enemy appeared.
The Harrow were.
That is the only way I can describe them. Their ships did not move like ships. They shifted and pulsed and reconfigured themselves in ways that defied physics as I understood it. They were dark against the darkness of space, somehow visible even when they should have been invisible, as if the universe itself was recoiling from their presence.
Contact, the tactical officer reported. Multiple bogies, consistent with Harrow fleet configurations, estimating 800,000 individual units.
The Valeth hierarchy had lost to forces a fraction of that size.
Morrison did not react. He simply nodded and said, "Begin Phase 1. What followed defied description. The human fleet did not advance in formation. It did not position itself for tactical advantage. Instead, it exploded outward in 12,000 different directions, each ship moving independently, following a pattern that must have been coordinated, but looked entirely chaotic.
What are they doing? I asked, unable to contain my confusion.
Decentralizing, Chen answered. She was standing beside me, her eyes fixed on the display. If we fight as a single force, the Harrow will adapt to our tactics and destroy us. So we're not fighting as a single force. Every ship, every squadron, every individual fighter is operating semi-autonomously, following general objectives but making moment-to-moment decisions independently.
That's chaos. Yes, she smiled grimly. That's the point. On the display, the human ships began engaging the Harrow. They died. I watched them die. Hundreds of them, then thousands, winking out of existence as the Harrow's terrible weapons tore through their hulls. Each death was a ship, a crew, hundreds of lives, and still they came, wave after wave, pouring fire into the enemy without hesitation. "They're sacrificing themselves," I whispered. "They're buying time," Morrison corrected, not taking his eyes from the display. "Every second they engage the Harrow is another second for Phase 2 to complete." "Phase 2? As if in answer, the display shifted. Behind the engaged Harrow fleet, deep in the region of space they had already conquered, new signatures began appearing. Hundreds of them. Thousands. "The Harrow don't guard their rear," Morrison said. "They've never needed to. No one has ever been able to get forces behind their advance line. They simply destroy everything in front of them and move forward." He smiled that unpleasant smile again. "We've been placing stealth units in their wake for 3 weeks. Mining operations, guerrilla squadrons, sabotage teams. While they were focused on the Valeth, we were seeding their entire conquered territory with surprises." The display lit up as the hidden human forces began their attacks. The Harrow fleet, for the first time in the entire war, hesitated. The battle lasted 18 hours.
I watched it all, unable to look away, unable to do anything but bear witness as humanity threw itself against the enemy that had destroyed my civilization.
They died in droves. I watched capital ships dissolve under concentrated harrow fire. I watched fighter squadrons sacrifice themselves to draw enemy attention away from critical targets. I watched men and women who had been alive moments before become nothing but debris and silence. But they did not stop.
Every time the harrow adapted to a human tactic, a new tactic emerged. Every time they concentrated their forces against one threat, 3 more appeared from unexpected directions. Every time they seemed to gain the upper hand, the humans did something that defied logic, something creative, something desperate, something that no enemy with a survival instinct would ever consider.
Because the humans, I realized, did not fight like a species trying to survive. They fought like a species that had already accepted death. And that made them more dangerous than anything the harrow had ever encountered. At hour 12, something changed. The harrow fleet, for the first time, began to contract. Not retreat. The harrow did not retreat. But they pulled back, consolidating their forces, focusing their attention on a single point. They're adapting, someone said. They're concentrating to break through our lines. No, Morrison said quietly. They're panicking. I looked at him. Panicking? The harrow don't...
Look at their formation. Look at the pattern. He pointed at the display. They've never faced an enemy that fights like this. They're designed to overwhelm, to consume, to destroy. But we're not giving them anything to consume. We're just noise, chaos. They can't find a pattern to adapt to because there is no pattern.
He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something that I had never expected to see in a human face. We're confusing them, he said, and while they're confused, we're killing them. At hour 16, the tide turned. The harrow fleet, reduced to perhaps 2/3 of its original strength, began fragmenting. Individual units broke away from the main force, moving erratically, attacking targets without coordination. They're losing cohesion, the tactical officer reported. We're detecting communication disruptions throughout their fleet structure. Phase 3, Morrison ordered. And the human fleet, battered and bleeding but still fighting, surged forward. They did not fight to survive. They did not fight to retreat. They attacked, relentlessly, mercilessly, with the focused fury of a species that had been fighting for its existence since the dawn of its history. I watched as the harrow died. I watched as the impossible became possible. I watched as humanity, the species we had dismissed as primitive and unstable and barely worth observing, did what 11,000 years of Valeth civilization could not. They stopped the advance. When the battle ended, 43% of the human fleet was gone. 7,000 ships, millions of lives, an entire generation of humanity's finest warriors reduced to debris and memory. Morrison stood at the viewport, looking out at the wreckage, his face unreadable. "Admiral," I said, approaching him carefully, I don't have words." "Then don't use any." His voice was hollow, exhausted. "Words won't bring them back. You won." "Did we?" He turned to look at me. "The harrow aren't destroyed, High Coordinator. They're wounded, fragmented, disorganized. But they'll recover, they'll adapt, and they'll come back. Then we'll fight them again." He shrugged. A gesture so casual that it almost seemed obscene in the context of what I had just witnessed. And again, for as long as it takes. That's what we do.
I stared at him, this exhausted old man who had just led his species into a battle that should have been unwinnable, who had watched millions of his people die, and who was already planning for the next fight.
"How?" I whispered. "How do you keep going?" Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "High Coordinator, do you know why we answered your SOS?"
Because we asked. No, he shook his head. That's what Dr. Webb said, and he's a romantic. The truth is simpler than that. He turned back to the viewport. We answered because we knew what it was like.
What was like?
Being alone, being desperate, facing something that should destroy you and having no one to turn to. His voice softened. We've been there, High Coordinator. We've been exactly where you are now, with no help coming, no rescue on the horizon, nothing but our own will to survive and the hope that somehow, against all odds, we might find a way through.
He paused.
When we heard your distress call, we didn't debate. We didn't analyze. We didn't calculate whether it was in our strategic interest to help. We just moved, because we remembered what it felt like to send an SOS and know that no one was coming.
I felt something break inside me then. Something old, something proud, something that I had carried my entire life without even knowing it was there. The SOS was too late, I said quietly. That's what Dr. Webb said. Too late for the coalition to respond. Too late for anyone to save us.
Too late for everyone else, Morrison agreed, but not for us.
He turned to face me fully, and in his tired, grief-stricken eyes, I saw something that transcended victory and defeat, success and failure, pride and humility.
I saw the soul of a species that had learned to fight in the dark.
High Coordinator, he said, your SOS was too late, unless you count humanity.
It took 2 years to fully defeat the Harrow.
2 years of brutal, grinding warfare across 100 fronts. 2 years of sacrifice and innovation and desperate hope. 2 years in which humanity led a coalition that eventually included 17 species, united against an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. The Valis fought alongside them. We learned to adapt, to improvise, to abandon our careful plans and embrace the chaos that humans seemed to thrive in. We unlearned 11,000 years of assumptions and remembered what it meant to struggle for survival. It was humbling. It was terrifying. It was the most important lesson our species has ever learned. When the last Harrow vessel was destroyed, the galaxy celebrated. But I did not celebrate. Instead, I returned to human space. I went back to Sierra 7, to the small functional station where I had first met Commander Chen and Dr. Webb. I walked through corridors that I now knew as well as any Valith crystal spire, and I found myself standing at a memorial. It was simple, a wall of names carved into dark stone, stretching further than the eye could see. 7,000 ships. 3,400,217 human lives, each one listed, each one remembered. Commander Chen found me there hours later. She was older now, her hair more gray than dark, her face lined with the weight of everything she had seen.
High Coordinator, she said. I didn't expect to see you here.
I had to come. I did not take my eyes from the wall. I needed to see this, to remember. She came to stand beside me, both of us looking at the names. You know what I find strange? She said after a long silence. Tell me,
When the war ended, everyone wanted to talk about how humanity had saved the galaxy, how we had risen to the occasion, how we had proven ourselves to the elder races, how we had earned our place among the stars. She shook her head, but that's not what happened. I looked at her. What do you mean? We didn't save the galaxy, High Coordinator. We just refused to let it die alone. She reached out and touched one of the names on the wall. Every person listed here knew what they were walking into. They knew the odds. They knew they probably wouldn't survive, and they went anyway, because that's what humans do when someone asks for help. Even when it means dying? Especially then. She smiled, and it was the saddest smile I had ever seen. We're not heroes, High Coordinator. We're not saviors. We're just stubborn. Impossibly, irrationally, suicidally stubborn. We don't know how to give up. We don't know how to accept the inevitable. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough. I stood there for a long time, reading the names, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had been sacrificed. And then I understood. The SOS had been too late. Too late for the Galactic Coalition's measured response. Too late for diplomatic channels and bureaucratic processes. Too late for anyone who needed to debate and discuss and decide. But it had not been too late for humanity. Because humanity did not debate when someone was dying. They did not discuss whether it was in their interest to help. They did not calculate odds or weigh costs or analyze strategic implications. They simply answered. That was what made them different. Not their technology, not their numbers, not their tactics. It was their instinct. Honed by millennia of survival, forged in the fires of their own endless struggles, to respond to suffering with action, to answer every cry for help with everything they had. The Harrow had been an unstoppable force. They had consumed everything in their path, adapted to every threat, overcome every obstacle. But they had never encountered a species that genuinely did not care about its own survival. They had never faced an enemy that would sacrifice everything, give everything, risk everything, not for victory, but simply because someone had asked. The universe is vast and cold and indifferent. It does not care about civilizations or species or dreams. It does not guarantee survival or success or meaning. It simply exists, and we exist within it, brief candles flickering against an endless dark. But humanity had learned something that my people, for all our wisdom, had forgotten. In the face of that indifferent vastness, there is only one thing that matters. We are not alone. And when the darkness comes, as it always does, as it always will, we do not face it alone. Not anymore. I am old now. Older than any Veleth has a right to be, having lived through the near extinction of my species and the war that saved us. I have seen wonders that my ancestors could not have imagined, and horrors that I pray my descendants will never know. But when I close my eyes, I do not see the great battles or the terrible losses. I do not see the Harrow's dark ships or the Valeth's crystalline spires. I see a small, functional station at the edge of human space. I see a woman with gray-streaked hair and patient eyes. I see a wall of names carved in stone. And I remember the lesson that humanity taught the galaxy. The SOS was too late. Unless you count humanity. And you should always, always count humanity.
I told him about the silence that followed each defeat, the terrible, empty silence that filled the void where our people used to be. When I finished, my voice was hoarse, my hands were trembling, and I realized with a shock of shame that there was moisture in my eyes.
Webb was quiet for a long moment.
Then he said, "High Coordinator, I have one more question for you.
When you came here, what did you expect from us? What did you think we would do?"
I hesitated. I don't know. I hoped perhaps you might send ships, supplies, something to buy us time.
Time for what?
To find a solution, to discover a weakness, to... I stopped, hearing the futility in my own words.
To survive long enough to figure out how to survive, Webb finished for me. Yeah, we've been there. He stood, walking to the screen on the wall. High Coordinator, I'm going to show you something. Something that very few non-humans have ever seen.
The screen flickered to life. The images that appeared were human history, but not the sanitized, curated version that appeared in their official cultural exchanges. This was the raw, unfiltered truth of what humanity had endured. I saw cities reduced to rubble and ash. I saw weapons that could level continents. I saw the faces of survivors emerging from underground shelters, blinking in the harsh light, surrounded by the corpses of everyone they had loved. I saw humanity tear itself apart again and again, and somehow put itself back together each time. This is what we were doing when your species was building its first interstellar ships, Webb said quietly. We were developing ways to annihilate ourselves more efficiently. We came within minutes of ending our own species, not once, but multiple times. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand something. He turned to face me. We're not better than the Harrow. We're not morally superior or more enlightened or more evolved. We have done terrible things to ourselves and to each other. We have committed atrocities that would make your historians weep. He paused, and something hardened in his eyes. But we're still here. The words hung in the air. We have never had the luxury of peace, he continued. We have never had 11,000 years of comfortable certainty. Every generation, we have faced something that should have destroyed us. And every generation, we have adapted, we have fought, and we have survived. You cannot fight the Harrow with survival instinct alone, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. You're right, Webb agreed. Survival instinct isn't enough, but it's where everything else begins. It's the foundation. He walked back to the table and sat down again, his eyes never leaving mine. High Coordinator, we're going to help you, but I need you to understand something first. What? The SOS you sent, the one that went out to the Galactic Coalition, it was transmitted 40 hours ago, correct? Yes. By the time it reaches most of the Coalition members, and by the time they debate and discuss and finally decide whether or not to act, the Harrow will have taken everything you have left. I felt the blood drain from my face. I know. The SOS was too late, he said. For most of the galaxy, at least. Their response will come after your civilization has fallen, and they'll spend centuries debating how it happened and what they could have done differently. Then why are we even having this conversation? Webb leaned forward. Because we received it immediately. Our communication networks intercepted it within minutes of transmission, and we didn't wait to debate. I stared at him. What do you mean? High Coordinator. It was Commander Chen who spoke now, her voice quiet but certain.
14 hours ago, the United Human Defensive Command initiated a full mobilization. Every reserve fleet has been activated. Every industrial center has shifted to war production. Every colony with a population over 50,000 has begun civil defense protocols.
That's impossible, I whispered. You couldn't have known. You didn't have time.
We've been watching the Harrow for 8 months, Chen said. We saw what they did to your outer colonies. We analyzed their patterns, their capabilities, their trajectory. We knew they were coming. We've been preparing ever since.
But you said nothing. The coalition heard nothing about...
We don't announce our preparations. She shook her head. We learned a long time ago that telling people you're getting ready for war only makes things worse. Better to stay quiet, stay ready, and move when the moment comes.
I tried to process what she was telling me.
Humanity, the species we had dismissed as primitive, as unstable, as barely worth observing, had seen the Harrow coming before we did. They had begun preparing while we were still trying to deny the threat existed. They had quietly, methodically readied themselves for a war we didn't even know was happening.
How many ships? I asked. My voice was barely audible.
Chen exchanged another glance with Webb.
When the full mobilization is complete, she said, approximately 12,000 combat vessels, another 40,000 support and logistics craft. That's not counting allied species who have agreed to coordinate with us, or the defensive platforms that ring every human colony world.
12,000 combat vessels.
We had started with 42,000 in my fleet alone, and we had been losing.
That's not enough, I said. The Harrow have consumed fleets 10 times that size. They adapt to every tactic, every weapon. They...
High Coordinator. Webb's voice cut through my rising panic. We know. Then you must understand. We know it's not enough to win. He held my gaze, and in his eyes I saw something that made my next words die in my throat. It was acceptance. Not despair, never despair, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality that was somehow more frightening than any battle I had ever witnessed. We know exactly what we're walking into, he said. We've modeled the scenarios. We've analyzed the possibilities. Our best projections suggest that a direct engagement with the Harrow, even with full human mobilization, has a less than 20% chance of success. Then why? The question escaped me before I could stop it. Why mobilize at all? Why sacrifice your species for a war you cannot win? Webb was silent for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small, sad smile that carried the weight of all human history in its curve. Because you asked. I remained on the station for 3 days. During that time, I was given access to observation feeds from across human space. At first, I watched out of desperation, hoping to find something, anything, that would reassure me that the humans had a plan I simply wasn't seeing. What I found instead was something that defied my understanding entirely. Human civilization was transforming before my eyes. Factories that had been producing consumer goods shifted overnight to weapons manufacturing. Mining operations that had been extracting resources for construction now focused exclusively on strategic materials. Orbital shipyards that normally operated on multi-year schedules began running around the clock, producing components at a rate that should have been impossible. But it was not the industrial capacity that shocked me. It was the people. I watched as millions of human civilians, people who had never held a weapon, never trained for combat, never even considered violence as part of their lives, began mobilizing for war. They formed into organized units with an efficiency that spoke of deep cultural preparation.
They distributed resources, established communication networks, prepared defensive positions.
They did not panic. They did not riot. They did not demand explanations from their leaders. They simply moved with a terrible purposefulness toward whatever fate awaited them. On the second day, Commander Chen found me in the observation lounge, staring at a feed from one of their core worlds. "They're not soldiers," I said without turning around. "Most of them have never fought anything in their lives. Why are they preparing as if they have?" She came to stand beside me, watching the feed. On the screen, a group of what appeared to be educators and administrators were organizing a supply distribution center with military precision. "Do you know what we teach our children?" she asked. "I'm sure I do not." "We teach them history. Not just the glorious parts, the defeats, the failures, the times when everything went wrong and we still survived." She paused. "And we teach them that someday it might happen again. That someday someone or something might come for everything they love, and when that day comes, they need to be ready to stand up and fight." "You raise your children for war?" "We raise them to survive." She turned to look at me directly. "High Coordinator, your people had 11,000 years of peace. You forgot what it means to truly fight for existence. We never had that luxury. Every generation of humanity that has ever lived has faced the possibility of extinction. It's in our cultural memory, our instincts, our very souls." She gestured at the screen. "Those people aren't panicking because they always knew this day would come. They've been preparing for it their entire lives, even if they didn't know what form it would take." I thought about the Valeth, about our beautiful crystalline cities, our carefully ordered society, our 11 millennia of confidence in our own permanence. We had forgotten. We had forgotten what it meant to be prey. On the third day, I was summoned to a briefing. The room was larger than the one where I had first spoken with Webb and Chen, filled with screens showing tactical displays and communication feeds. A dozen humans were present, along with several representatives from other coalition species who had arrived in the past 24 hours. At the head of the room stood a man I had not yet met, older, with silver hair and a bearing that spoke of decades of command. His uniform bore insignia I did not recognize. "High Coordinator," he said, nodding to me. "I'm Admiral James Morrison, commanding the Combined Human Defense Fleet. Please, take a seat." I sat, acutely aware that I was the most senior Valeth representative present, and also, somehow, the least powerful person in the room. "I'll keep this brief," Morrison said, pulling up a holographic display of the galaxy. "The Harrow have continued their advance. Based on our projections, they will reach the core Valeth worlds within 72 hours. At their current rate of expansion, they will encounter human space approximately 3 weeks after that." He paused, letting the information sink in. "Our full mobilization will be complete in 48 hours. At that point, we will have a combined force of approximately 17,000 combat vessels, including contributions from allied species, positioned along the projected Harrow Advance Corridor." 17,000. I heard my own voice, as if from a great distance. Against an enemy that has destroyed fleets 10 times that size. "Yes." Morrison's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Which is why we're not planning to fight them the way you did." I looked up sharply. "Explain." "High Coordinator, with respect, the Valeth approach to the Harrow has been reactive. You've met them in space. tried to outmaneuver them, engaged in conventional fleet actions, and every time they've adapted to your tactics and overwhelmed you.
He pulled up another display, a complex web of lines and nodes that I didn't immediately understand.
We're not going to try to defeat the Harrow in a fair fight. There's no such thing as a fair fight when you're facing an enemy that can adapt faster than you can innovate. He pointed to the display. Instead, we're going to do something they can't adapt to.
And what is that?
Morrison looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something that I had not seen in any human since my arrival.
Fire.
We're going to give them everything we have, he said, all at once. Every weapon, every ship, every resource. We're going to hit them with absolutely everything in a single coordinated assault across 12,000 different points simultaneously.
That's a suicide attack. No, he shook his head. A suicide attack is when you throw yourself at an enemy and hope for the best. This is different. This is a calculated gambit. We're going to overwhelm their adaptive capacity by presenting them with more threats than they can process at once.
You can't possibly know that will work. We can't, he agreed. But we know that nothing else will. And we know that if we wait, if we try to preserve our forces, if we fight a gradual campaign, we will lose. So we're not going to do that. He pulled up another display, this one showing the disposition of human forces. The Harrow adapt to patterns, he continued. They learn tactics and develop counters, but they've never faced an enemy that was willing to commit everything in a single moment, without reservation, without holding anything back. They've never faced an enemy that genuinely did not care about survival. Because that kind of enemy doesn't exist, I said. Morrison smiled. It was not a pleasant smile.
It does now. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity.
I was given a position on Morrison's command vessel, the Unconquered, a ship that was larger and more heavily armed than anything I would have expected from a species we had dismissed as primitive. It was not beautiful. Human aesthetics seemed to prioritize function over form in a way that I found almost alien, but it was brutally effective. As we traveled toward the front lines, I watched the human fleet assemble around us. Warships of every size and configuration, carriers loaded with fighter craft, bombers bristling with weapons that I did not recognize, support vessels carrying supplies, medical equipment, repair drones, and behind them, the civilian transports, millions of humans who had volunteered to serve in any capacity they could, from mechanics to medics to simple laborers. They did not look like an army going to war. They looked like a species going to its final stand. And yet there was no despair, no resignation. The humans moved with purpose, with determination, with a grim confidence that I found utterly alien to my experience. I spoke with many of them during those 2 days. I listened to their stories, their fears, their hopes. And gradually, I began to understand something that I had not understood before. The Valeth had built a civilization based on the assumption of permanence. We planned for centuries, built for millennia, assumed that the universe would unfold according to our expectations. When the Harrow came and shattered those expectations, we had no framework for responding. We could not comprehend an enemy that could not be incorporated into our careful plans. Humans were different. Humans had never expected to survive. Every generation, they faced the possibility of extinction. They knew deep in their bones that the universe was not fair, was not ordered, was not designed for their benefit. They understood that survival was never guaranteed, only fought for. And because they had never assumed they would survive, they were not paralyzed when survival became uncertain. They simply fought harder.